Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to be working on the performer component of the UiPath Automation Summarizer Solution Accelerator. Let's get started. So before we begin, I just wanted to go over some of the things that we have already completed as part of the previous episodes of this series. The first thing is that in the previous episodes, I did demonstrate how to deploy your configuration by referring to this folder here, the Automation Summarizer demo folder, right? But for this episode and future, I will be working with Automation Summarizer Skywalker. And that is because I originally started work on this folder and then I deployed my configuration to this folder. And second, all the relevant integration service connections are set under this folder. And therefore, I really do not want to recreate everything again in the demo folder, right? So here you can see again, the last time we set the connection to AWS Bedrock. And in my case, I am working with the Gmail integration service connector instead of Outlook 365. And this is something for the future. This is a custom connector to Hugging Face that is actually operational and working. Maybe I will cover this in a future video, but that remains to be seen. So this is where my automation summarizer process is going to be deployed. And the name of this automation cloud instance is Titan Robot 1019, right? And if I switch screens a little, you will see that the automation summarizer process has been deployed to Titan Robot 1019, but the data that it is targeting is on a completely different automation cloud instance. And here you can see in the VNC viewer, I am remoted in and the orchestrator instance is open. And the name of that automation cloud instance is Titan Robot 2022, and the tenant name is Skywalker, right? And if I go into a folder called integration services, remember this is not integration service. This is just a modern folder I named as such. So do not be confused. If I go under integration services modern folder, you will see some of these queues. And please do keep that in mind because they will be referred to later, right? So with that clarified, I would like to now begin with the setup of the performer process. All right, so I am in UiPath Studio and the performer process is open in Studio. And before I proceed, the first thing that I would like to let you know very clearly is that this episode largely is about making your performer process functional. That means this performer process must compile. You must be able to deploy it to your automation cloud instance, and you must be able to run it, right? But that is not the same as whether your automation is going to deliver you the right results. That's an entirely different subject because once your performer process starts to run, it is going to pull data from the orchestrator instance that you're targeting, and then it is going to compose a prompt, and that prompt is going to be sent to your LLM, and then the LLM is going to send the data back using which your performer process is going to generate a report, right? Now, all of that has to be fine-tuned later, right? And that is not within the scope of this video. So this video is only to show you what are the issues that you're going to likely face when you're dealing with the performer process, and what do you do to get it running so that you can deploy it and run it end to end. So with that clarified, let us start with some of the easiest checks that we can get past. The first thing I would do is open this file under the project folder. It is called retrieve LLM data, and that is under, if I go under framework, it is directly under the framework folder. And if you open that and scroll all the way down, you will come to this part here. in that flow, right? And here you can see that I'm using an AWS Bedrock connector, and then I'm pointing to my integration service connection, Amazon Bedrock, that I've already set up in my automation cloud instance. And then I have the model that was recommended in the solution accelerator documentation, right? So make sure that you are able to get this connection that you set up in your automation cloud, and it is available to you, and that you can view all the models that are available to you under the AWS Bedrock connection. Now, remember a few things. First, if you're not able to see this connection, you're most likely not connected to your folder, right? Because those integration service connections are created under a certain folder, and therefore you must switch to that folder and be connected to that folder from Studio, right? That's the first thing. The second is, I think I've already covered this in the previous episode. Make sure that you have access to these models, right? And the third thing that you have to keep in mind, this is also in the Solution Accelerator documentation. Just because you requested for access to a certain LLM, for example, Anthropic Cloud, and you got it, does not mean that at the time you're working on this project that it might be up and available. Remember, AWS Bedrock is a marketplace, and it is possible that Claude can be taken offline and another LLM can take its place, right? So the suggestion in the documentation is, if those models are not available to you, then you have to probably use a new model, which means that you will have to alter the prompts and make sure that when this performer process is working, that the data going to the LLM from your performer process is accurate and acceptable. The prompt that is composed is correct and acceptable, and that when you get the data back, your performer process is actually producing the right kind of result, right? And that is why I said that getting the performer process to work first uh, is uh, is important, right? And during that course, you got to make sure all these moving parts are available to you and they are functional. And only after that, you will go into the more operational detail about uh, the data that goes in and the response that comes back from the LLM, right? So this is one of the easiest checks. Make sure that you are all set and your connection is working. The second item is something specific to my implementation. If you recall from the previous episodes, I had mentioned that I'm not going to be using Office 365 connector because I don't have an Azure tenant operational. Instead, I'm going to be using the integration service for Gmail. So here you can see that there is a flow called send exceptions email, but alongside it, there is something called send exceptions email underscore Gmail, right? So if I open that and scroll all the way down, you should see the connection to your Gmail integration service is available and that you have no errors. That means that your integration service for Gmail is operational, right? So these are the first two very easy things to get past, and I recommend that you make sure that they are working. All right, so this is where we are going to go a bit deeper into the performer process and make some of the changes that we need to make so that this process will work, right? So we start off from the state machine in main. We get into the init state, and then in the init state, you will see a call to invoke authenticate workflow, right? And that flow is authenticate.xaml. And if you go into authenticate.xaml, you will see yet another call to invoke authenticate underscore cloud, which is here. And then make your way to authenticate cloud. Here, under authenticate cloud, there is yet another call. You see, this is the fourth level deep. It's called make authenticate request underscore cloud. And you can see all of those flows under the authentication subfolder of your framework in the project, right? So you are in the fourth flow here, all the way from the init state. And if you recall from the previous episodes, when I set up the orchestrator authentication, I set it up to use the orchestrator keys. I did not use OAuth. And therefore, this is where I will be setting the input parameter in use OAuth flow equal to false, right? So if I open the import arguments of this flow and scroll down to in use OAuth flow, I have set it to false, right? So this is the first deeply nested change that you will have to make to your performer. The next change we are going to make is optional, and this is relevant to the way I have implemented this performer template. I did tell you that I'm going to be using send exceptions email underscore Gmail XAML instead of send exceptions email. So here is where that change is applied. So again, if you start from the state machine main and go into end process, here in this container or the sequence, you will see this container to send exceptions email. And that is where I have actually commented out the original send exceptions email flow and then pulled in the implementation of my Gmail related flow. So basically, you swap out the original send exceptions email with send exceptions email underscore Gmail. Again, this is optional, but if you are going to be using another integration service connected to send your emails, then this is where you will make the change. And the other thing to notice, this email notification is used only to send exception notifications, right? I did not see references to this flow anywhere else in the performer. In case you want to be sending these reports over email to a set of people, then you most likely have to change this performer template and enhance it to send those reports out to the groups of people based on who that report is targeted to. The next set of changes that we are going to make are going to be in the assets and also the configuration file. So let's go over some of those changes. You see that the send exceptions email generally will use the exception email to configuration setting parameter, right? And that exception email to comes from your configuration file. And if you go under the data folder of this performer template, you will find the config Excel file. And if I open it and navigate to assets, note that this setting points to your configuration deployment. That means this is an asset, right? So exception email to points to an asset named Automation Summarizer underscore exception email to, right? So you go to this asset in your deployment. So in this case, I am in Automation Summarizer Skywalker. So I'm going to go back into my tenant. So I'm already in Automation Summarizer Skywalker. I go into the assets, and then you will see that email exception email to. So this is the basically the asset that you will need to make changes to, and then you can go in here and put in the email address or the list of email addresses to whom this email the exceptions need to be emailed out to, right? Since we are already in the configuration file, there are other things that you might want to take a look at and update if you have not already done so. So normally this is set by default to Automation Summarizer. I have set it to the folder that I'm operating in, Automation Summarizer Skywalker. The second thing is the cloud account and the cloud tenant. And as you can see, because I'm targeting a remote orchestrator automation cloud instance and orchestrator tenant, I have set the names to Titan Robot 2022 and Skywalker. So these are some of the relevant changes that you might want to look over once and change as necessary. The next thing would be to go into the advanced settings. And there are many number of settings that you might want to pay attention to, and then there are those that you will have to make some changes. We'll come to that later. But here you can see some of those timeout values that have got to do with your orchestrator API interaction and also some of the retries that your performer process is going to attempt if things fail, right? So here, this is the maximum request threshold, and this is set to 200. And this comment is really good to read because sometimes your orchestrator API requests are not done in a single shot, right? There may be multiple requests to be made if it has to get the detail that you require. For example, if you want to get the detail of an asset, it needs to know what folder that asset belongs to or what organization unit it belongs to. So there might be additional API calls, and those API calls also count when you make this API call to get your asset, right? It might be actually 2 or 3 API calls. And therefore, the number of requests must be set based on your situation, right? Based on how you're licensed or how fast you can send your requests and what is the maximum allowable threshold, right? So this is something that you might want to look and set. The second would be the number of retries. Everything comes in threes, so 3 would be a good number to start with. And the second would be the retry interval, right? This is set to 5,000 milliseconds, which is about 5. And then, of course, your HTTP request timeout, right? If you're making an API request, this is going to wait for 60 seconds before that request fails, and then a retry kicks in, right? This item in bright yellow, which I have annotated in red, we will come back to it in a few, but this is something very important that you need to complete, but we'll discuss that later. In the next section, we are going to be making a set of changes without which your performer process might fail, right? So we will take a look at that next. All right, so one of the things that's going to throw you off balance when you are working with this performer is that you can actually compile this application, deploy it to your orchestrator, and you should be good to go, right? But here's the kicker, right? First, if you run this and you do not have any data, right, in your orchestrator tenant that you're targeting, what's going to happen is it's going to run and you're going to get a report that has nothing in it, basically just all zeros. And that will give you a feeling that, hey, this is great, this is running end to end, right? But the problem here is if you have data and if you run it, the chances of it failing are pretty high. Again, it all depends on how your data is structured, how much of data you have, what are the filters that you're setting, right? And when the data comes back, could there be a problem in the performer that will cause it to fail to process that data, right? Or could it be possible that the data is good, but when the response comes back from the LLM, there is a chance that your performer process is going to fail, right? So we cannot predict the exact points of failures and we can't cover all possible failures, but I can show you some of those that you need to make without which the possibility of your performer failing are pretty high, right? If you navigate to the common folder under your framework and open this flow, make HTTP request, one of the things that you will encounter here would be a threshold failure, right? So that's one of the most important things that you will have to change. And for that, we'll have to go back to our config file. And if you go into your settings tab, here I did mention about this yellow line here, right? So if you look at the Swagger definition of the APIs, right, you will see that there is a limit of 1000, right, when requesting queue data. This is important. If you are going to be requesting queue data, then if you go into Swagger and test some of the APIs and see the documentation there, it says that the top limit is 1000. But when you actually try that with a limit greater than 100, it is going to fail. And it is going to fail with this error here. And you see that I've actually documented this error in my configuration file. And that error is similar to this message. The field take must be between 0 and 100. So there is a take parameter for the QData API, and that should not exceed 100. If you try to set it to anything more than 100, it's going to fail. Therefore, set this parameter to something 100 or less. Do not set it to any higher. Again, it all depends on your orchestrator limit, the version of the API you're using. So I would recommend to look at this first and make sure that you start at a low number and then increase it and see where the failure occurs. But in my case, nothing above 100 actually worked, right? The other thing that will cause your performer to break is also in this flow, make HTTP request. So as you debug through the process, you will see that this flow is called and it makes an API request to the queue items endpoint, right? Now, one of the problems with the queue items endpoint, which looks like this, is you see, this is the request that you're actually going to be making. But this is something specific to queue items. I did not find this in any other API request. The APIs return in their response an attribute called odata.count. Now, all other API calls will return this. The problem with queue items is there is a query string parameter that you need to set. If you don't set that parameter, this entire item will be missing in your response. So the fix that you want to apply is at the very top, right? So when you step into this make HTTP request flow, you get to the endpoint, and that endpoint will be ending with slash queue items, right? So this is the API call to the queue items. Now, what I do here is I'm going to check if the endpoint contains slash queue items. And if it does, then what I do is I append a query string parameter called $count is equal to true. Now, if you do not set this parameter in the query string, then what's going to happen is this odata.count is not going to come back. And then you're going to have a failure in another flow, right? So that is why I said that when you test this performer against an orchestrator instance where there is no data, you will most likely not run into this problem, right? But when there is data and then the business logic steps into processing that data, it is going to look for this count. And if it does not find this count, that is where you're going to find that the performer process will break, right? So where is this going to fail, right? If you don't apply this fix, where is it going to fail? So if you navigate to under common, there are a couple of flows. Don't get confused. One is called make get request, which is singular. And then there is something called make get requests, which is plural, right? Go to the singular one, make get request. So if you go into make get request, you will see a place where the flow is going to interrogate the response from the API. And that is this activity called assign total result size, right? If I open this up, it is going to fail here because queue items will not return odata.count unless you have set count is equal to true in your URL, right? So if you have set it, and then when you check for the batch result object, you will get this value without any issues. Otherwise, it's going to fail at the spot. The other thing that you also would want to do would be to add this here, value of int64. I've seen that it shows errors in certain cases, but you can test that out. But this works. And this is where you link these 2 points of failure, right? If you make that change in make HTTP request, then there will be no failure here in make get request, right? So this is another thing that you might want to check and fix. The other change that I found that I need to make with the plural form of make get request is this location here. So what happens is you are actually ready to compile, and when you're building the project, it's going to fail at this point, right? Make get request is going to fail at this point. That is because here you can see a couple of items that I've actually commented out. right? It says construct odata filter dot XAML and then make get request dot XAML. Again, it's this singular form. The problem here is that the data type is not properly set. You see that the dictionary type in config is set to dictionary, string, comma, generic value. It should be actually dictionary, string, comma, object, right? So what happens here is that in the flow, the data type is probably not matching, right? And you will see that there is a conversion error. And you cannot convert a dictionary of type string comma generic to string comma object or vice versa. You will see that error, right? So what you have to basically do is you have to change the data types of these flows, construct OData filter and make get request by going into these flows and changing their argument types to dictionary of string comma object, right? And then that's not the end of it. The problem here is these code stages are also going to break, right? So when you make that change, you will see some these code stages breaking. So if you go into the properties of these code stages, for example, if I go here and try to bring up the properties and go into arguments, you will most likely see the in config being passed in here. And this will also be set incorrectly to string comma generic value. You will have to change that to string comma object. So you will see multiple failures in these two flows, right? One is make get request, and then the other flow is construct OData filter. So you will have to go in and make those changes, right? So here I have commented it out and put in the other flows where I've actually fixed those data types. And here you can see there are no errors. I've just preserved it here so that you can see what is the fix and what was the situation before and after, right? So this is another change that you want to make, because if you don't, this project will not compile. All right, so these two changes that we are going to talk about are those that will cause your processor, your performer process to fail at runtime. You will be able to run the processor. It'll be able to successfully get to make your API request and then get the data back. But then when the data is being prepped, this is where you're going to run into some failures, right? And these two failures that I encountered are predominantly in these two flows, right? If you go into the um, entities and then go under queues, there are a couple of flows called get queue data, queue items data, and get queue processing data, right? So what these flows essentially do is when you get your data back from the orchestrator, they convert the data that is coming from the orchestrator into data rows, right? And then each data row is added to the relevant data table, right? And that is where you might run into unique key violations, right? That's because the queue items data table has got a unique key constraint on it. And then if you're trying to add a record that already exists in it, you will run into failures. For now, what I've done is I have surrounded this particular action here, add data row, with a try and catch, and I have kind of made an error sync. So if when it writes it to the log, we can go back to the log and see what was that ID that we received, and maybe come back later and fix it, right? So the same kind of error happens here as well in get queue processing data. And you will see that the fix that I've applied is almost identical, right? Rightfully, once you get this performer off the ground, and when you're ready to do your data analysis and make sure that the data you're getting back is correct, that is where you most likely have to see why this constraint is being violated and maybe apply a better fix. But for now, this is a fix that I've applied just to get our performer template running end to end.